Nguyen Van Thon called it the Whispering Death. He drove a Molotova truck on Route 92 through the Mugia Pass in 1970, hauling ammunition south under canopy so thick he couldn't see the sky. He didn't need to see it. The sound told him everything. A low drone, almost gentle, circling somewhere above the clouds. Then the world turned white. A 105mm howitzer round punched through the truck ahead of him and scattered it across 40 meters of laterite road. Thon survived because the crew above him chose the lead vehicle first. He abandoned his truck and ran into the jungle. The drone kept circling for another 2 hours. A captured NVA logistics officer told his interrogators something worth repeating. "We do not fear the fast jets. They come once and leave. The black plane stays." That phrase, the black plane, showed up in multiple debriefs across 1970 and 71. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know I keep coming back to stories where one weapon system changes the math completely. A like and a subscribe help me keep digging into these. Drop a comment if there's a particular aircraft or operation you want me to cover next. The black plane was the AC-130 Spectre, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules cargo aircraft rebuilt into something its designers never intended. A flying artillery platform that could loiter over a target area for hours, pouring fire from altitudes where ground troops couldn't effectively shoot back. 7,000 feet was typical, sometimes higher. The crew orbited in a left-hand pylon turn, banking the aircraft so its portside weapons pointed straight down at the road below. You might think a lumbering 4-engine turboprop would be easy prey over hostile territory. Slow, predictable flight path, no maneuverability to speak of. And you'd be right about every one of those vulnerabilities. The AC-130 was objectively a terrible idea on paper. 4 Allison T-56 engines pushing 135,000 pounds through the air at 300 knots, max. No armor worth mentioning. A 37mm anti-aircraft round through the wing spar and 14 men go down in the jungle. The Air Force lost 6 Spectres during the war. Every loss was catastrophic. Full crew, no ejection seats. But the truck kill numbers told a different story. During Operation Commando Hunt in the 1970-71 dry season, AC-130 crews claimed over 12,000 trucks destroyed or damaged along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Intelligence analysts later revised that figure downward. Significantly, the actual number remains disputed. What nobody disputes is that NVA logistics officers considered the Spectre the single greatest threat to their supply network. A single 20mm shell casing from an M61 Vulcan cannon weighs about a quarter pound. An F4 Phantom on a night interdiction run over the trail could burn through its entire ammunition load in less than 6 seconds of trigger time. 6 seconds. Then the pilot was done, heading back to Da Nang or Ubon with nothing left to shoot, having covered maybe 800 meters of road in a single screaming pass at 450 knots. The fundamental problem was simple. Fast movers couldn't linger. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a road, it was a network, somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 miles of interconnected paths, river crossings, bypasses, and parallel routes threading through Laos and Cambodia. The NVA's Group 559, the logistics command responsible for keeping supplies moving south, employed tens of thousands of laborers just to maintain it. They could repair a bombed-out section of road in hours, sometimes less. An F-105, Thunder Chief dropping 6 750-pound bombs on a suspected truck park might crater 200 feet of road surface. By the following night, traffic was rolling again through a detour cut 50 meters to the west. The math never worked. Fast movers delivered enormous destructive energy in tiny windows of time over microscopic patches of ground, then vanished. The trail absorbed the punishment and kept functioning. Night made everything worse. NVA truck convoys moved almost exclusively after dark, headlights off, drivers navigating by white-painted rocks placed along the roadside. An F4 crew flying at altitude couldn't see individual trucks without illumination. The standard solution was dropping parachute flares, 2 million candle power magnesium flares that lit up the jungle for about 3 minutes each. A flare ship, usually a C-130 or C-123, would orbit and kick out flares while the strike aircraft dove in below. The coordination was clumsy. By the time a pilot rolled in on a target illuminated by a swinging descending flare, the shadows had shifted, depth perception went haywire. Trucks that were visible 5 seconds ago disappeared under tree cover. The after-action reports from 1966 and 67 are blunt about the results. 7th Air Force analysts estimated that fast movers were destroying roughly one truck for every 93 sorties flown against the trail at night. 93 sorties per truck. Each sortie cost fuel, maintenance hours, crew fatigue, and risk to aircraft worth millions of dollars. An F-105 loaded for a night interdiction mission cost roughly $2,400 per flight hour to operate. Multiply that across thousands of sorties, and the economics were staggering, all for a fleet of Soviet-built trucks that cost maybe $3,000 each. Why not just fly more sorties? Fly around the clock? The airframes couldn't take it. Pilot availability couldn't sustain it, and the trail kept growing. Every year, Group 559 added new branches, new storage areas, new underwater bridges invisible from the air. The NVA was willing to accept losses that would have been politically unthinkable in Washington. A truck driver killed on Route 961 got replaced by another truck driver the following week. The Air Force needed something that could stay over the trail for hours, see in the dark, find individual trucks under canopy, and kill with precision. What they already had sitting on the ramp was a cargo plane. How do you turn a cargo plane into a weapon? In 1964, an Air Force captain named Ronald Terry had an answer that sounded like a joke. Mount 3 SUU-11A minigun pods on the port side of a C-47 Skytrain, the same Douglas transport that dropped paratroopers over Normandy 20 years earlier, and fly it in circles. Each minigun fired 6,000 rounds per minute. 3 of them together could put a bullet into every square yard of a football field in 3 seconds. Terry's concept wasn't new. The idea of a side-firing aircraft had been kicking around since 1926 when a lieutenant named Fred Nelson proposed mounting a machine gun sideways on a biplane. Nobody cared. The concept sat in a filing cabinet for almost 4 decades until Terry and a small team at the Aeronautical Systems Division at Wright-Patterson dusted it off and made it fly. The first operational AC-47s, call sign Spooky, deployed to Vietnam in late 1965. They were immediately effective in one very specific role, defending hamlets and outposts under night attack. A Viet Cong battalion hitting a Special Forces camp at 2 a.m. would suddenly find itself under a river of tracer fire from something circling lazily overhead. The psychological effect was enormous. Defenders on the ground described the minigun fire as a solid red cone pouring from the sky, accompanied by a sound less like gunfire and more like a giant ripping canvas. The VC called the AC-47 the Dragon. Troops at besieged outposts learned to call for Spooky, the way a drowning man calls for a rope. But the AC-47 had limits that became obvious fast. The airframe was ancient. A World War II-era transport with 2 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 radial engines, cruising at maybe 130 knots, service ceiling around 24,000 feet in theory, but operationally it flew much lower, typically 3,000 feet during fire missions. At 3,000 feet over a defended target, the aircraft was inside the effective range of every heavy machine gun the NVA owned. The DSHK 12.7mm, the Soviet heavy machine gun that American troops called the Dashka, could reach out past a mile with rounds that would punch through the C-47's unarmored aluminum skin like it wasn't there. Spooky crews accepted this. They flew anyway. 4 AC-47s were lost in combat between 1965 and 1969. The weapons were wrong for truck killing too. 7.62mm minigun rounds could shred personnel in the open, suppress a tree line, break up an infantry assault. Against a loaded ZIL-157 truck carrying crated ammunition on a hardpack road, they were insufficient. You could riddle the cab and kill the driver, sure, but the cargo often survived. The truck behind it would push the wreck off the road and keep moving. What the trail interdiction mission needed was explosive ordnance, shells heavy enough to destroy the vehicle and its contents in a single pass, then block the road with a burning hulk that stopped the entire convoy. Sensor capability was the other gap. Spooky crews aimed using a basic target designating sight mounted in a window. The pilot looked through it, found the target visually or by flare light, and held the aircraft in a bank that kept the guns on point. No infrared, no radar, no low-light television, no forward-looking sensors of any kind. On a dark night over triple canopy jungle, Spooky was essentially blind unless someone on the ground popped a flare or the flare ship was already overhead. The AC-47 could defend a position it could see. It could not hunt. The records from 7th Air Force's Operational Analysis Office make this distinction clearly. C-47s were credited with helping defend thousands of hamlets and outposts during their deployment. Their truck kill numbers along the trail were negligible. The aircraft was a defensive weapon asked to perform an offensive mission, and the mismatch showed in every after-action summary. So the concept worked. Side-firing gunships could deliver sustained, accurate fire from a stable orbit in ways no fast mover could match. A spooky crew could stay on station for hours, where an F-4 got minutes. The pylon turn geometry meant every round went where the pilot aimed, not where the aircraft's forward momentum carried it. The operational record backed that up. What the Air Force needed was a bigger airframe that could carry heavier guns, better sensors, more armor, and enough fuel to loiter deep over Laos where the trail's main arteries ran. The C-130 Hercules could do all of that. It could also carry enough weight to mount something no previous gunship had attempted, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and eventually a 105mm howitzer firing from an airplane in flight. The engineering problem alone was staggering, 18,000 pounds. That was the available payload margin on a C-130A after accounting for fuel, crew, and basic airframe weight. 18,000 pounds to fill with guns, ammunition, sensors, fire control computers, and wiring. Then somehow make it all work together, while the aircraft flew in circles at 200 miles per hour in the dark. The program was called Gunship 2. It started in 1967 at the Aeronautical Systems Division at Wright-Patterson, the same shop that had midwifed the AC-47. But where spooky had been a field modification, essentially bolting hardware onto an existing plane, Gunship 2 was an integrated weapons system designed from the sensor backward. The thinking had flipped. Instead of asking what guns fit on a C-130, the engineers asked what sensors could find a truck at night under jungle canopy, then built the weapons suite around that answer. The sensor package they assembled was unlike anything that had flown before on a tactical aircraft. A forward-looking infrared detector, FLIR, could pick up engine heat through foliage. A low-light level television camera amplified ambient starlight and moonlight until a dark road became visible on a cockpit monitor. A beacon tracking radar gave precise slant range to the target, and an analog fire control computer, the ASQ-145, tied all of it together, calculating ballistic solutions in real time based on aircraft altitude, airspeed, bank angle, wind, and the ballistic characteristics of whichever weapon the crew selected. The computer is worth pausing on. It weighed over 400 pounds and occupied a rack the size of a refrigerator in the cargo bay. By modern standards, the processing power was laughable, less than what sits in a gas station calculator today. But it could solve the pylon turn firing geometry continuously, updating the solution as the aircraft's orbit shifted. The pilot saw a crosshair on his gun sight that moved in real time. When the crosshair sat on the target, the ballistics were solved. He pressed the trigger and the rounds went where the computer said they would. The weapons themselves represented the real leap. Two 20mm M61 Vulcan cannons carried over from the minigun concept, good for soft targets and area suppression. Two 40mm Bofors L60 autocannons, World War II-era anti-aircraft guns adapted for air-to-ground work, each firing 120 rounds per minute of high-explosive shells that could wreck a truck with a single hit. The Bofors was the workhorse. Crews loved it for the combination of rate of fire and destructive effect. One 40mm shell weighed about 2 pounds and carried enough explosive filler to blow a Zill's engine block through its cargo bed. The first prototype, designated the AC-130A and nicknamed Surprise Package, deployed to Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in September 1968. The crew that took it into combat for the first time over the trail had trained for weeks at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, firing at old trucks dragged onto bombing ranges. The training targets sat still on flat open ground in daylight. Nothing about that prepared them for what Route 961 looked like through a fluoroscope at 8,000 feet on a moonless Laotian night. The trucks down there were moving. The AN/ASD5 Black Crow sensor weighed about 60 pounds and looked like an oversized radio receiver bolted to the belly of the aircraft. It detected electromagnetic radiation from unshielded ignition systems, the spark plugs, distributor caps, and magneto coils inside Soviet-made truck engines. Every time a cylinder fired in a gas or Zill engine, the ignition system leaked a tiny pulse of radio frequency energy. Black Crow could pick up that pulse from miles away. The NVA drove with their headlights off. They painted their trucks to blend with the canopy. They built bamboo frameworks over road segments to hide from aerial photography. None of that mattered to Black Crow because the sensor wasn't looking for the truck. It was listening for the engine's electrical heartbeat. An operator in the cargo bay watched a directional display that showed bearing to the source. As the AC-130 orbited, multiple bearings from different positions along the circle triangulated the target's location on the ground. The FLIR operator would then slew the infrared scope to that bearing and look for the hot spot of an engine under canopy. If the canopy was too thick for infrared, the low-light television camera, which could produce a usable image under nothing but starlight, would scan the same area for movement on the road surface. 3 different sensors hunting the same target through 3 different physics: electromagnetic, thermal, optical, gravitational inertia of a convoy that couldn't stop and couldn't hide. You might think the NVA could just shut their engines off when they heard the gunship overhead. Some tried, but a convoy of 30 trucks stopped on a mountain road in Laos created its own problems. Engines cooling at different rates gave the flyer operator a string of fading heat signatures that marked each vehicle's position as clearly as parking lights. The trucks couldn't move without restarting their ignitions. Black Crow would hear them the moment they tried. We could find trucks that didn't know they'd been found. A sensor operator from the 16th Special Operations Squadron put it that way in a post-war interview. The crews understood what they had. For the first time in the air war over the trail, the hunter could see in total darkness and detect targets through solid cover, then engage with precision weapons before the enemy knew the orbit had begun. The NVA adapted, eventually. Shielding ignition systems with metal covers was one approach. Diesel engines that had no spark ignition to detect were another. The adaptations took months. During those months, Spectre crews owned the night over the trail's most critical choke points, and the truck kill numbers started climbing in ways that made 7th Air Force analysts recheck their data. The 20 Mike was a good weapon looking for a different war. Major James Grubaugh flew Spectre missions out of Ubon in 1970 and said this to a debrief officer after watching his Vulcan rounds spark off a road surface without stopping a single truck in a 4-vehicle convoy. The 20mm M61 could put rounds on target with extraordinary accuracy from the AC-130's orbit. The problem was what happened when they got there. Against soft-skinned vehicles carrying rice or medical supplies, the Vulcan was adequate. Against a ZIL loaded with crated 122mm rockets, the shells often punched clean through without detonating. The fusing required a certain threshold of resistance to arm. Sheet metal and wooden crates didn't always provide it. The 7.62 minigun had the same issue, only worse. Carried over from the AC-47 configuration, the minigun's role on early AC-130s was suppression, hosing down anti-aircraft positions while the heavier weapons worked the convoy. Crews found it useful for that. For truck killing it was essentially worthless, a garden hose against a bonfire. So the Bofors 40mm became the primary truck killer on the surprise package and its successor variants. Each high-explosive round hit with enough force to crack an engine block, ignite fuel, and scatter a truck's cargo across 50 meters of road. A good crew could walk Bofors fire down a line of stopped trucks and leave each one burning. The rate of fire, 120 rounds per minute per gun, meant a 4-second burst put 8 shells into a target area the size of a parking space, truck after truck until the road was empty. But the Bofors had its own limitation: range. The AC-130 had to orbit at altitudes that kept it within the Bofors effective envelope, which meant flying close enough to the ground that the NVA's increasingly dense anti-aircraft network could reach back. Every mile of standoff distance the aircraft could gain was a mile of safety margin between the crew and the 37mm batteries the Soviets were shipping south in growing numbers. The Bofors couldn't give them that distance. What could was insane. A 105mm M102 howitzer, the same lightweight field artillery piece the Army used for fire support at every firebase in Vietnam, mounted sideways in the cargo door of a flying aircraft. The shell weighed 33 pounds. Muzzle velocity was roughly 1,600 feet per second. Maximum effective range from the AC-130's typical orbit altitude let crews engage from slant ranges exceeding 2 miles. A single round could obliterate a truck so completely that bomb damage assessment photos showed nothing but a crater and scattered debris where a vehicle had been seconds before. The engineering required to make this work was extraordinary. Recoil was the central problem. The M102 generates roughly 19,000 pounds of recoil force when fired. On the ground, that force transfers into a trail spade dug into dirt. In an aircraft, it transfers into the airframe. The mounting system had to absorb that energy without ripping through the cargo floor or shifting the aircraft's center of gravity mid-orbit. Engineers designed a recoil slide mechanism that bled the force over a longer impulse, spreading the shock across reinforced structural members tied into the C-130's wingbox. The aircraft shuddered with every shot. Crews described it as a full-body punch felt through the seat, the floor, the fillings in your teeth. Loading was manual. An enlisted gunner pulled each 33-pound round from a ready rack, carried it to the breech, and rammed it home by hand. The rate of fire depended entirely on how fast that gunner could work, typically 6 to 10 rounds per minute. In a 4-hour mission over the trail, a strong loader might handle over 200 rounds. His arms would be dead by the time they landed back at Ubon. The AC-130E Spectre variant that carried the howitzer entered combat in 1972. With the 105, the aircraft could stand off beyond the effective range of most optically aimed anti-aircraft guns while delivering artillery-grade firepower with computer-calculated precision. A howitzer round arriving from 8,000 feet gave no warning, no tracer arc visible from the ground, no sound until after impact. The first indication a truck driver had that Spectre was overhead was the vehicle in front of him disappearing. Airman First Class David Keller was already bleeding from a cracked knuckle when he rammed his 68th round of the night into the howitzer breech. The skin between his thumb and index finger had split open somewhere around round 40. He kept loading. Below the aircraft, a convoy on Route 922 had been 16 trucks 5 minutes ago. The FLIR operator was counting 11 fires. This was the 1969 to 1970 dry season, October through May, when the trail carried its heaviest traffic and Spectre went to work every single night. 12 AC-130s operated out of Ubon during this period. 12 aircraft against a logistics network that stretched over 12,000 miles of roads and paths, threading through Laos, Cambodia, and the Vietnamese panhandle. The operational rhythm was relentless. Aircraft launched at dusk, flew 4 to 6 hours over assigned segments of the trail, returned to Ubon before dawn, and were rearmed and refueled for the next night. Maintenance crews worked through the tropical heat all day to keep the fleet flyable. Sensor operators slept in air-conditioned hooches until late afternoon, ate dinner, briefed at 1700, and were airborne by 1830. The numbers from that season made 7th Air Force Headquarters in Saigon sit up straight. Intelligence estimates put NVA throughput attempts at roughly 68,000 tons of supplies pushed south during the dry season. Spectre crews, working alongside other interdiction assets, but accounting for the vast majority of confirmed truck kills, destroyed or damaged enough vehicles to deny approximately 47,000 tons of that material from reaching its destination. 47,000 out of 68,000. Nearly 70% of everything Hanoi tried to move south during the peak logistics window. The Laotian fruit bat, Eonycteris spelaea, roosts in the same limestone karst formations along the Mugia Pass that the NVA used as truck parks and supply caches. A single colony can number over 500,000 individuals. When Spectre's howitzer rounds hit the karst, the concussion drove clouds of bats into the night sky, visible on the FLIR as swirling thermal blooms that sensor operators initially mistook for secondary explosions. This connects to nothing about the interdiction campaign. Back to the trucks. The kill claims were controversial then and remain controversial now. 7th Air Force used a methodology that counted fires visible on post-strike infrared imagery as destroyed vehicles. Critics, and there were plenty, especially in the Army and the CIA, argued that a burning truck wasn't necessarily a destroyed truck, that fuel fires could burn without the vehicle being a total loss, and that overlapping missions could easily count the same vehicle twice. A post-war CIA assessment used the phrase systematic overcounting to describe the Air Force's interdiction statistics. Their word. But even the most conservative adjustments to the numbers couldn't erase what was happening on the ground. NVA units in the South reported critical shortages of ammunition during early 1970. Field hospitals ran low on antibiotics. Meanwhile, replacement troops arrived at their units having eaten less than 800 calories a day for weeks during the march south because food stocks at way stations along the trail had been destroyed or never arrived. The supplies weren't getting through at the rates Hanoi needed. Whether Spectre killed 6,000 trucks, or 4,000 trucks, or 2,500 trucks during that dry season, the effect downstream was measurable in empty magazines and hungry soldiers. A single 37mm anti-aircraft round weighs about 1.5 pounds. It leaves the barrel of a Type 55 gun at roughly 2,800 feet per second, and at the altitudes where Spectre orbited during the 1969 to 1970 dry season, flight time to target was under 4 seconds. The NVA had been watching their trucks burn for months. They understood the pattern, the slow left orbit, the consistent altitude, the predictable bank angle required to keep the guns on target, the fact that the aircraft always came back to the same stretch of road. An aircraft flying circles in the sky is, from the gunner's perspective, barely moving. The deflection problem that makes fast movers so hard to hit simply doesn't exist against a gunship in its pylon turn. Hanoi's response was methodical. They moved anti-aircraft battalions into Laos along the trail's most critical choke points, Ban Karai Pass, Mu Gia Pass, the Chapone logistics hub. By the 1970-71 dry season, intelligence estimates placed over 700 anti-aircraft weapons along the primary interdiction zones, 37mm batteries dug into revetments on ridgelines above the road, 57mm guns positioned at the approaches to major truck parks. ZPU heavy machine guns filled the gaps between them, and interlocking fields of fire covered the airspace where Spectre had to fly. The crews knew. They knew because the tracers told them. A 37mm tracer round burns a dull orange-red visible for miles, and when multiple batteries opened up simultaneously, the sky around the aircraft filled with what crews called flaming basketballs, rising in lazy-looking arcs that were anything but lazy. Pilots learned to watch the tracers and break the orbit when the rounds started tracking rather than leading, a sign the gunners had found the range and were walking fire onto the aircraft. The problem was that breaking orbit meant breaking the firing solution. Every second spent evading was a second the convoy below kept moving. The first AC-130 lost to enemy fire went down on May 24, 1969. 5 more would follow over the course of the war. Each loss hit the Spectre community at Ubon hard. The crews were small, 13 to 14 men per aircraft, and the squadron was small. Everyone knew everyone. A lost aircraft meant 13 empty bunks, 13 missing faces at the club, 13 footlockers of personal effects boxed up and shipped home. We were losing people we had breakfast with. A navigator from the 16th Special Operations Squadron said that in a recorded oral history, and the flatness in his voice carries more weight than any dramatic retelling could. The AC-130 was a magnificent truck killer operating in an environment that was becoming a death trap. The aircraft had no ability to outrun or outmaneuver a surface-to-air missile. Its electronic countermeasures suite was designed for an earlier threat environment. When the SA-2 guideline batteries began appearing along the trail in 1972, the calculus changed completely. The SA-2's engagement envelope extended well beyond any altitude the AC-130 could reach. A gunship that climbed to avoid AAA flew directly into the SAM threat band. One that stayed low to duck the SAMs descended into the dense anti-aircraft artillery below. The operational window was collapsing from both ends. On March 28, 1972, Spirit 03, callsign Spectre 17, took a direct hit from a 57mm round over the trail in Laos and crashed with the loss of all 14 crew members. The wreckage burned for hours in a ravine so steep that recovery teams couldn't reach the site for weeks. On the night of June 18, 1972, an AC-130E with the call sign Prometheus was orbiting near Chapone when an SA-2 detonated close enough to shear the left wing. The aircraft came apart in midair. All 16 men aboard died. There were no ejection seats and no bailout altitude. The smell of burning avgas reached a forward air controller flying 15 miles south at 12,000 feet. The 6 Spectre losses across the war killed a total of 71 aircrew members, 71 men who flew into the same airspace night after night, knowing the defenses were getting thicker, the guns more numerous, the SAM operators more practiced. 7th Air Force responded by restricting Spectre operations to lower threat segments of the trail during periods of heavy SAM activity. The result was predictable. The most effective weapon in the interdiction campaign was being pulled back from the places it was needed most because the cost of losing another aircraft had become politically unbearable. The jungle floor at night in Laos smells like wet rust and rotting vegetation, a thickness you breathe rather than inhale. Staff Sergeant Eugene Fields was lying face down in it, alone, sometime after midnight on April 23, 1970. Hours earlier, he'd been aboard AC-130 call sign Warlord, orbiting a segment of Route 966 southeast of Chapone. The mission was routine by Spectre standards: locate convoy traffic, destroy it, go home. Warlord had already hit several trucks when the 37mm rounds found them. The shells punched through the fuselage in a sequence so fast that survivors, survivor, singular, couldn't separate the individual impacts. Fire broke out immediately. The pilot attempted to maintain control long enough for the crew to bail out, but the aircraft was already coming apart around them. Warlord went down in the Laotian jungle with 10 men still inside. Fields got out. The records don't say exactly how, whether he jumped or was thrown clear during the breakup, whether his parachute deployed fully or partially, whether he landed in canopy or hit the ground directly. None of this appears in the available documentation. What the records do confirm is that he was the only one. 10 men dead. The aircraft commander, both pilots, the navigator, the fire control officer, the sensor operators, the gunners, men whose last seconds were spent in a burning fuselage spinning through triple canopy in absolute darkness. Fields landed somewhere in that same darkness with injuries, no radio contact, no weapon that mattered, and NVA anti-aircraft crews who knew exactly where the aircraft had gone down. You might think rescue came quickly. Spectre losses triggered immediate search and rescue protocols. Sandy A-1 Sky Raiders and Jolly Green Giant helicopters scrambling from bases in Thailand at first light. But first light was hours away, and Fields had to survive the night in territory the NVA controlled completely. Every anti-aircraft position within 5 miles knew a plane had just crashed. Patrols would already be moving toward the wreckage. He evaded through the night, alone and hurt, navigating by nothing but instinct and the sound of his own breathing. When the Sandys arrived at dawn and began searching the crash area, Fields made contact. The Jolly Green pulled him out later that morning. 10 families received notifications. 1 man walked out of the jungle. The Air Force awarded Fields the Purple Heart and sent him home. His 10 crewmates from Warlord are listed on Panel 15W of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. Fields carried whatever he carried for the rest of his life in silence. He never gave a public interview. A brass placard bolted to the wall of the 16th Special Operations Squadron's ready room at Ubon listed confirmed truck kills by month. By the end of the 1970-71 dry season, the running total had passed 12,000. Someone had to replace the placard with a larger one to fit the numbers. The new placard was still on the wall when the last Spectre missions over the trail ended in 1973. 12,000 trucks, maybe more. The Air Force's official count ran higher than that, and the CIA's adjusted count ran lower, and the actual number sits somewhere in the space between institutional pride and institutional skepticism. But take any number you want. Take the most conservative estimate. Cut the Air Force figures in half, then cut them again. You're still looking at thousands of vehicles destroyed, tens of thousands of tons of supplies denied, an interdiction campaign of extraordinary tactical effectiveness executed by a few hundred men flying the same dozen aircraft into increasingly lethal airspace night after night for years, and the trail kept running. That contradiction is the hardest part to sit with. Hanoi absorbed the losses. They built more roads. When Spectre owned a particular choke point, NVA engineers cut bypass routes through the jungle, sometimes in as little as 72 hours. When truck losses spiked, they shifted to bicycles. A modified bicycle could carry 400 pounds of supplies on a bamboo frame extension, pushed by a single man walking alongside it on a footpath invisible from the air, generating no ignition signature for Black Crow to detect, producing no heat bloom for the FLIR to find. They ran petroleum through pipelines buried 3 feet underground, stretching eventually over 1,000 miles from North Vietnam into the south. They moved supplies by river on sampans that looked identical to civilian fishing boats. They cached ammunition in caves and dispersed it so widely that destroying any single cache point meant nothing to the overall flow. The NVA Logistics Command, Group 559, named for the month and year of its founding in May 1959, employed over 50,000 personnel dedicated solely to keeping the trail operational. 50,000 people repairing roads, rebuilding bridges, driving trucks, pushing bicycles, manning anti-aircraft guns, running way stations. When Spectre killed a truck driver, another driver was already trained and waiting. When a road segment became too dangerous to use at night, traffic shifted to alternate routes or moved in daylight under canopy so thick that even the FLIR couldn't penetrate it. You might think this means the interdiction campaign failed. The math suggests otherwise, and also confirms it. NVA combat units in the South were chronically undersupplied throughout the period of peak Spectre operations. Offensive timetables slipped, ammunition rationing was constant. The 1972 Easter Offensive, when it finally came, succeeded in part because Hanoi had spent 2 years stockpiling supplies specifically to overcome the interdiction bottleneck. They planned around Spectre the way you plan around weather. An obstacle to be managed, not a threat to be defeated. The AC-130 did exactly what it was designed to do. It found trucks in the dark and killed them with precision that no other platform in the American inventory could match. The Bofors gun, the howitzer, the FLIR, Black Crow, the pylon turn, all of it worked. The engineering was brilliant and the crews were brave beyond any reasonable expectation. But the strategic framework those crews served inside was broken from the start. Interdiction without ground control of the interdicted territory is attrition, and attrition only works when you can attrit faster than the enemy can replace. Hanoi could always replace. The population of North Vietnam in 1970 was roughly 21 million people. The entire American interdiction effort along the trail, Spectre included, was trying to squeeze a river by pressing on one bend. The brass placard at Ubon recorded the kills. Nobody made a placard for the supplies that got through anyway, carried on the backs of men walking barefoot through mountains in the dark, arriving at their destinations hungry and exhausted, and still carrying enough ammunition to fight. What do you do with a weapon that works perfectly against an enemy who doesn't need the things you're destroying? The Air Force never answered that question during the war. They didn't have to. The AC-130 kept flying, kept killing trucks, kept generating statistics that looked like victory on briefing slides at 7th Air Force Headquarters in Saigon. The truck kill numbers went up, the supply flow went down, temporarily, locally, never decisively, and the war ground forward on its own logic, indifferent to the burning wreckage along Route 966. After the ceasefire in January 1973, the surviving Spectre aircraft flew home to Hurlburt Field in Florida. The crews who'd spent years over the trail went back to training rotations and peacetime schedules. A few stayed in special operations, while others separated from the Air Force entirely. The sensor operators who could read a flyer scope, the way a radiologist reads an X-ray, took their skills into civilian careers, where nobody knew what Black Crow meant or why it mattered. The AC-130 itself never went away. That's the other half of this story. The airframe kept evolving. The AC-130H model, then the AC-130U Spooky 2, then the AC-130J. Ghost Rider with its 105mm cannon replaced by precision-guided munitions and a 30mm chain gun. Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every American conflict since Vietnam has seen some variant of the Spectre concept orbiting overhead, and the basic geometry hasn't changed. Left pylon turn, sensors on the port side. Weapons bearing down through the same ancient trigonometry that Captain Terry worked out with a grease pencil on a C-47 window in 1964. The NVA feared it more than any fighter jet because a fighter jet passed overhead and was gone. Spectre stayed and chose its targets with the patience of a predator that doesn't need to chase anything because nothing below can run fast enough. A captured NVA logistics officer told his interrogators in 1971 that convoy commanders along the trail had standing orders to halt all movement and kill all engines the moment a spotter reported the sound of a low-orbiting propeller aircraft. The order wasn't, "Take cover." The order was, "Stop existing as a target. Go dark. Wait. Hope it picks someone else." But Hanoi also understood something about the weapon that its builders never fully reckoned with. A truck is steel and rubber and gasoline, replaceable in 6 weeks by a factory in the Soviet Union or China. The man driving it can be replaced in 6 months by a teenager from Haiphong who believes he's fighting for his country's reunification. The road itself can be rebuilt in 3 days by a labor battalion working with shovels and bare hands. The AC-130 was optimized to destroy objects. The war was being fought by people willing to carry ammunition on their backs if every truck in the inventory burned. An NVA after-action assessment captured in 1973 used a phrase that translates roughly as, "The Americans built a perfect machine for the wrong problem." Whether that translation is precise is debatable. The document has been rendered differently by different analysts, but the sentiment tracks with everything the numbers show. Between 1968 and 1973, AC-130 gunships flew over 10,000 combat sorties along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They destroyed or damaged an estimated 12,000 trucks by Air Force count, likely between 4,000 and 8,000 by adjusted CIA estimates. 6 aircraft were lost. 71 crew members were killed. The 16th Special Operations Squadron at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base flew more consecutive nights of combat operations than any other unit in the theater. Average sortie length was 4.5 hours. Average ammunition expenditure per mission ran to roughly 60 rounds of 40mm Bofors and 24 rounds of 105mm howitzer. The 105 crews loaded each round by hand. On the morning of August 15, 1973, the day the last American combat sortie of the war was flown over Cambodia, a Spectre crew chief at Ubon walked the flight line doing post-mission inspections on 2 AC-130s that had come in before dawn. He logged 4 new shrapnel holes in the port fuselage of the lead aircraft, signed the maintenance form, and filed it in a cabinet with 6 years of identical forms stacked underneath.